In the early summer of 1977, a quiet meeting was held on the 7th floor of Exxon's headquarters in New York. The room was filled with senior executives, scientists and engineers, men in suits, men in lab coats, men in command of one of the largest and most powerful energy companies in the world. They weren't gathered to discuss drilling strategy or refining efficiency. The presentation was led by James Black, a senior scientist at Exxon Research and Engineering. What he told the room was clear and astonishing. The burning of fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal, was releasing large quantities of CO2 into the atmosphere. That carbon dioxide was building up, trapping heat and altering the Earth's climate. In the first place, Black explained, there is general scientific agreement that the most likely manner in which mankind is influencing the global climate is through carbon dioxide release from the burning of fossil fuels. It was 1977, 11 years before NASA scientist James Hansen's famous Senate testimony. 20 years before the Kyoto Protocol. 30 years. And they didn't just know, they funded it. In the years following Black's warning, Exxon launched one of the most ambitious corporate climate research programs in the world. Their scientists built advanced climate models, collected data aboard company-owned tankers, published peer-reviewed papers, and worked alongside leading academics. Internally, the company's conclusions mirrored those of the broader scientific community. Unless fossil fuel consumption was drastically reduced, the Earth would face severe warming by the 21st century. By 1982, Exxon's internal memos estimated that atmospheric CO2 concentrations could double by the mid-21st century, leading to average global temperature increases of 2 to 5 degrees Celsius. The company predicted rising sea levels, melting glaciers, and widespread ecological disruption. One internal report even warned that significant changes in climate could occur within the time span of Exxon's strategic planning. In other words, this wasn't a distant problem. It was their problem. It was everyone's problem. But then silence. By the late 1980s, something changed. Exxon's tone shifted. Publicly, the company downplayed the certainty of climate science. It emphasized uncertainty, questioned models, and framed climate change as a topic of ongoing debate. Internally, the science hadn't changed, but externally, the message did. The reason wasn't scientific, it was strategic. As the 1980s closed and the 1990s began, the world's awareness of global warming grew. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change (IPCC) was formed. The United Nations launched negotiations toward what would become the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And suddenly, Exxon faced a terrifying possibility: regulation. To the fossil fuel industry, climate action meant caps, restrictions, taxes, threats to their business model. ExxonMobil, already the largest private oil company in the world, had everything to lose. And so, behind closed doors, a new agenda took shape, not to engage with the science, but to undermine it. This shift was not passive, it was deliberate. ExxonMobil began funding think tanks, policy groups, and scientists who questioned the reality of climate change. Between 1998 and 2005 alone, the company spent at least $16 million on groups like the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the Heartland Institute, and the George C. Marshall Institute, all of which produced reports denying or minimizing the threat of global warming. They sponsored newspaper op-eds, launched ad campaigns, and lobbied aggressively against international climate agreements. The goal was not to disprove climate change. That would be scientifically impossible. The goal was to sow doubt, to delay action, to make the public, the media, and politicians believe that the science was unsettled, when in fact, it was not. This tactic was not new. It mirrored the strategy once used by big tobacco when the evidence against cigarettes became overwhelming. The industry didn't try to argue they were safe. Instead, they argued that the science was inconclusive, that more research was needed, that regulation was premature. ExxonMobil took the same playbook and scaled it globally. In 1997, just as world leaders gathered in Kyoto to sign the first binding international agreement on reducing greenhouse gases, Exxon's then CEO, Lee Raymond, delivered a keynote speech. He claimed that climate models were unreliable, that climate science was immature, and that the economic risks of reducing emissions were too high. His words echoed around the world and into the chambers of the US Senate, which voted 95-0 against ratifying the Kyoto Protocol. Behind the scenes, ExxonMobil lobbyists worked to ensure that American climate policy remained stalled. They cultivated relationships with lawmakers, particularly within the Republican Party, turning climate change into a partisan issue. They funded campaigns, ghost-wrote legislation, and met regularly with officials to steer regulatory outcomes, all while their own internal scientists continued to report the same truth: the planet was warming. Fossil fuels were driving it, and the consequences would be catastrophic. But these reports never saw the light of day. Instead, ExxonMobil redoubled its public efforts to obscure the facts. In 2004, a leaked memo revealed that Exxon had pressured the Bush administration to replace the lead U.S. climate negotiator with someone more industry-friendly. The following year, journalists discovered that Exxon was quietly coordinating with the American Petroleum Institute to push anti-science talking points to the media and school systems. By the mid-2000s, climate denial was no longer a fringe movement. It was mainstream. Politicians echoed talking points crafted by Exxon-funded groups. Cable news featured debates between climatologists and non-scientists paid by the fossil fuel industry. Public confusion soared, action stalled, and emissions kept rising. By the time the world entered the 21st century, the science of climate change had matured beyond theory. The models were tighter, the predictions more urgent. Ice core samples, temperature records, and satellite data all told the same story: Earth was warming and fast. The cause, overwhelming in its clarity, was human activity. Fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, were releasing billions of tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year, trapping heat and driving ecosystems toward collapse. But if you lived in the United States, you wouldn't have known that. You would have seen headlines questioning the science. Television anchors pitting climatologists against industry lobbyists as if they were equal authorities. Opinion columns claiming climate change was a hoax, a natural cycle, or a plot to expand government power. Behind that blizzard of misinformation was a singular force: ExxonMobil. In the wake of their internal pivot from science to strategy in the late 1980s, ExxonMobil refined its weapon doubt. It was no longer enough to question the evidence they now had to flood the public square with noise. They created a universe of think tanks, institutes, and independent voices that shared one goal: confuse the public just long enough to delay regulation. The campaign was sophisticated, disciplined, and global. From 1998 onward, ExxonMobil spent tens of millions funding a web of organizations designed to look like grassroots movements, but which in fact were part of a tightly coordinated network. The Heartland Institute, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute. These groups published reports, held press conferences, and gave testimony before Congress. They produced experts who appeared on news panels, penned op-eds in major newspapers, and gave speeches at energy conferences. They weren't scientists, they were marketers of uncertainty. The documents that later emerged revealed how ExxonMobil provided talking points, ghost-wrote reports, and sometimes even coordinated media appearances. In one internal memo, a communications strategist wrote, "Victory will be achieved when average citizens understand, recognize uncertainties in climate science. Not when science was disproven, but when people simply stopped trusting it." At the same time, ExxonMobil continued to profit from the very future it was helping to destroy. As global awareness of climate change grew, so did Exxon's share price. Oil was booming. Demand was high. Emerging markets in China and India promised massive growth. And with governments still gridlocked on climate action, there was nothing to stop expansion. The Kyoto Protocol, signed in 1997, had been neutered in Washington. In 2001, the Bush administration withdrew the US from the agreement, entirely citing economic concerns and private lobbying from ExxonMobil. A 2001 memo uncovered by reporters revealed that Exxon had asked the administration to remove climate scientist Robert Watson from his position as chair of the IPCC. Weeks later, Watson was gone. In 2005, ExxonMobil was the world's largest publicly traded company. Its influence extended far beyond Capitol Hill. It sat on policy advisory boards. It contributed to presidential campaigns. It funded congressional candidates. And through its sheer market capitalization, it held sway over global investment behavior. What Exxon said about climate mattered not because it was true, but because it was powerful. Then in 2006, a shift began. Public pressure mounted. Climate disasters became more visible. Hurricane Katrina had devastated New Orleans. Global temperatures continued to rise. Al Gore's documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, sparked a renewed wave of climate concern. And under scrutiny, ExxonMobil began to change its tone. It published a climate position statement. It claimed to support responsible energy development. It acknowledged that human activity was a contributing factor to climate change. The message was carefully constructed, a vague acceptance of science, wrapped in corporate language designed to sound responsible but without commitment. Behind the scenes, the money still flowed. Between 2007 and 2015, ExxonMobil continued to fund groups that promoted climate skepticism. It supported lobbyists who fought carbon taxes. It contributed to campaigns that blocked renewable energy mandates. And while it claimed to be reducing emissions, it spent less than 1% of its capital budget on low-carbon technologies. But something was shifting in the outside world. Shareholders, once content with short-term profits, began to ask harder questions. In 2016, a group of institutional investors launched a campaign demanding that ExxonMobil disclose its climate risks, specifically how global climate policy could impact the value of its fossil fuel assets. If the world transitioned away from oil and gas, how much of Exxon's reserves would be stranded? How much of the company's future was a mirage? Exxon resisted disclosure, but pressure grew. Then came the leaks. In 2015, Inside Climate News and the Los Angeles Times published a groundbreaking investigative series, Exxon: The Road Not Taken. The reports drew on internal documents, memos, and interviews that proved beyond doubt that ExxonMobil had known about climate change since the 1970s, had conducted some of the most advanced early research, and had chosen to suppress that knowledge while funding denial. The evidence was damning. Congress launched inquiries. Attorneys general from New York and Massachusetts opened investigations into whether ExxonMobil had misled investors and the public. Lawsuits followed. Activist campaigns intensified. Exxon Knew became a rallying cry. The company's response was denial, not of climate change, but of culpability. They claimed the reporting was biased, that their views had evolved, that they were now committed to a lower carbon future. But the facts remained. For decades, ExxonMobil had possessed the knowledge to act. It could have warned the world. It could have led a transition. Instead, it chose silence. Then, it chose sabotage. By 2016, the tide had begun to turn. The stories were no longer about what ExxonMobil didn't know. They were about what it did know, when it knew it, and how far it went to suppress it. As the Inside Climate News and Los Angeles Times investigations reverberated, a legal and political reckoning took shape across the United States. New York's Attorney General Eric Schneiderman launched a sweeping investigation into whether ExxonMobil had misled investors and the public about the financial risks of climate change. Soon after, Massachusetts joined with its own probe. The question wasn't simply whether Exxon had spread misinformation. It was whether it had committed fraud. The stakes were enormous. For decades, ExxonMobil had maintained that climate policy posed little risk to its business. It had calculated oil reserves, made projections, and secured investments, all under assumptions that the world would not meaningfully regulate carbon emissions. If that assumption was knowingly false, the company could be in violation of securities law. The lawsuits alleged that Exxon had engaged in greenwashing publicly, talking about its commitment to climate action while internally planning for a high-carbon future. Court documents revealed discrepancies between Exxon's public carbon cost estimates and the lower costs used in its internal accounting. If proven, this misrepresentation could mean billions in financial deception. ExxonMobil denied wrongdoing. It called the investigations a politically motivated fishing expedition. It mounted a legal counterattack, suing the state attorneys general to block their efforts. The company deployed high-powered law firms, filed procedural motions, and turned the legal battle into a slow war of attrition. But the scrutiny did not end in courtrooms. Shareholders began demanding transparency. In 2017, A landmark vote took place at Exxon's annual general meeting. For the first time, a majority of shareholders supported a resolution requiring the company to assess and disclose its climate-related financial risks. The vote sent shockwaves through the boardroom. Exxon had lost control of its own narrative. That same year, former employees began to speak out. Whistleblowers described a culture of silence where scientists were discouraged from speaking publicly, and climate projections were carefully framed to avoid alarming conclusions. One former researcher said it wasn't about denying science, it was about managing optics. But while the legal and financial worlds wrestled with liability, another reality was unfolding elsewhere on the front lines of climate change. In southern Louisiana, entire communities were watching the sea swallow their land. Rising tides, more intense hurricanes, and coastal erosion had forced some Native American tribes like the Isle de Jean Charles Band of Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw to become America's first climate refugees. Their displacement was not abstract. It was physical, and it was permanent. In California, record-breaking wildfires consumed homes, forests, and lives. Scientists linked the fires to hotter temperatures, prolonged drought, and shifting weather patterns, all symptoms of a warming climate. Communities in the Pacific Northwest began choking on summer air thick with smoke. The climate crisis was no longer tomorrow's story. It was now. In the Arctic, thawing permafrost released methane, a greenhouse gas far more potent than CO2. Entire ecosystems began to collapse. Polar bears starved. Reindeer died en masse. Indigenous communities watched their hunting grounds vanish. The warming wasn't linear. It was accelerating. And in the global south, the toll was even more devastating. In Bangladesh, rising seas displaced millions. In sub-Saharan Africa, prolonged drought triggered famine, war, and mass migration. In island nations like Kiribati and Tuvalu, the ocean itself became an existential threat. And in all these places, fossil fuel companies like ExxonMobil remained distant architects of destruction, untouchable and insulated by jurisdiction borders and profit. The world was waking up, but too slowly. Activists began connecting the dots between fossil fuel corporations and climate injustice. They pointed to how the poorest communities bore the brunt of a crisis caused by the wealthiest. How ExxonMobil, despite having less than 1% of the global population's workforce, had contributed more than 3% of global industrial CO2 emissions since 1965. And how the same communities being destroyed by climate change were also the least responsible for causing it. In 2019, more than a dozen municipalities from New York to San Francisco filed lawsuits against ExxonMobil and other oil majors seeking billions in damages for climate-related costs, seawall construction, wildfire response, health impacts, and infrastructure repair. These weren't symbolic suits. They were modeled on big tobacco litigation, aiming to prove that the fossil fuel industry knowingly caused harm, lied about it, and should be made to pay. ExxonMobil argued that climate change was a global issue and that responsibility could not be pinned on one company. But emails, memos, and marketing records said otherwise. In one internal memo from the late 1990s, Exxon strategists wrote, "Victory will be achieved when average citizens understand, recognize uncertainties in climate science." That language, eerily similar to tobacco industry playbooks, appeared in court filings, activist campaigns, and congressional hearings. The evidence mounted. In 2021, the non-profit outlet Unearthed released a secret recording of a senior ExxonMobil lobbyist. In the video, the executive admitted that Exxon had fought climate regulations, opposed carbon taxes, and used third-party groups to influence public policy. He described how the company targeted key senators to soften climate legislation. The admission wasn't a bombshell, it was confirmation. Still, Exxon survived. Despite the lawsuits, the exposés, and the mounting climate disasters, ExxonMobil remained a financial titan. It posted record profits in 2022, benefiting from energy shocks triggered by the war in Ukraine. It invested billions into new oil and gas projects. It launched ads promoting carbon capture technology, a solution many scientists say is unproven at scale. The public relations had changed. The behavior had not. It begins with a question that still echoes through courtrooms, classrooms, and climate conferences. Can you forgive a company that knew and chose profit over the planet? For decades, ExxonMobil stood at the center of a slow-moving catastrophe. Its scientists were ahead of their time. Its executives were behind their conscience. And its strategy funding doubt delaying action and shaping policy succeeded in ways even its architects couldn't have imagined. But the truth has surfaced. It cannot be reburied. In the years following the flood of investigations, whistleblowers and lawsuits, a new movement emerged, one not just for climate action, but for climate justice. Around the globe, people began asking not only what must be done, but who must pay? Who should be held accountable for the fires, the floods, the hunger, the loss of home culture and life? In the Netherlands, environmental groups took Shell to court and won. In Germany, courts ordered the government to strengthen its climate targets. In the Philippines, a human rights commission declared that fossil fuel companies could be held legally and morally responsible for climate-related deaths. And in the United States, dozens of cities and states continue to sue ExxonMobil and its peers, arguing not just for compensation, but for truth. The legal framework is still catching up. International law has no precedent for prosecuting climate deception. There is no ecocide tribunal, no global mechanism for climate reparations. And yet the landscape is shifting. Each ruling sets new ground. Each hearing chips away at the myth that fossil fuel giants are too big to blame. But ExxonMobil didn't just fight regulation, it also shaped the language of climate responsibility itself. Consider the term carbon footprint. Popularized in the early 2000s, it encouraged individuals to measure their personal emissions, how they drive each shop. What few people realize is that the concept was heavily marketed by British Petroleum BP and supported by Exxon-aligned think tanks. The goal: shift the burden of climate action from corporations to consumers. The message was clear: you are the problem. And for many, it worked. Decades of advertising, lobbying, and cultural engineering created a false narrative that climate change was the result of individual choices, not systemic design. That recycling more and flying less could undo centuries of industrial pollution. That the responsibility lay with citizens, not the companies who profited from their dependence. Today we know better. Climate change is a systems failure, and systems are designed by boardrooms, by policies, by companies like ExxonMobil. That's why the calls for change now demand more than just acknowledgement. They call for systemic overhaul. In 2022, a global campaign titled "Make Polluters Pay" gained traction. It called for a fossil fuel damages tax levied on the profits of oil majors and used to fund adaptation and recovery in vulnerable nations. The logic is simple: those who caused the crisis should help repair it. The push for a loss and damage fund gained support at UN climate talks. For the first time, even oil-producing nations were forced to confront the price of inaction. ExxonMobil has responded with polished ads, glossy sustainability reports, and a new emphasis on carbon capture and storage (CCS). They promise innovation efficiency and a low-carbon future. But critics say these technologies are a smokescreen, a way to justify continued extraction while presenting the illusion of progress. The numbers don't lie. In 2023, Exxon announced plans to increase oil and gas production by over 1 million barrels per day over the next 5 years. Less than 2% of its capital expenditure was allocated to renewable energy. Its emissions continue to rise, and it remained a top contributor to methane leaks, one of the most potent greenhouse gases. Meanwhile, the world continues to warm. July 2023 became the hottest month ever recorded on Earth. Fires ravaged Canada, Greece, and Maui. Floods displaced millions in Libya, Pakistan, and China. Ocean temperatures in the North Atlantic reached record highs. Coral reefs bleached, crops failed, and still the companies most responsible were insulated by lobbying, legal protections, and public amnesia. But not everyone forgot. At the 2023 UN Climate Summit, a coalition of island nations demanded that fossil fuel companies be brought before the International Court of Justice. Youth activists staged die-ins at Exxon's headquarters. Indigenous leaders demanded land rights and an end to drilling on ancestral lands. Scientists marched with signs that read, "We told you so. You didn't listen." And yet there is still time. Time to act, time to hold the powerful accountable, time to build a world not ruled by oil but powered by justice. That means regulation, not just pledges. That means transparency, not just rebranding. That means dismantling the infrastructure of denial. ExxonMobil spent decades building and replacing it with systems rooted in equity, science, and truth. The climate crisis is no longer a warning. It is here. And as the seas rise, so too does the demand for reckoning. What Exxon knew, what it hid, and what it delayed will be studied for generations. But it is our generation that must decide what comes next. Because the next page in this story is not yet written. It can be one of collapse or one of repair, one where corporations finally stand trial for what they've done, or one where they once again walk away richer, cleaner in name only while the rest of the world burns. That decision still belongs to us. The cover-up is over. The question now, will justice ever begin?